Okay, should we rock and roll?
Yes, let's do it.
Fantastic. Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Juliette Tobias-Webb and I'm a behavioural scientist in Australia, and Vishal is in New Zealand, as I think many of you will know as well, and he's the Chief Behavioural Scientist or founder of Behavioural by Design. And really, this session is designed to be or this series. So we'd like to do quite a few of these sessions and make it a series looking at wellbeing by design. But it's a series that is designed to be semi-informal, but also we've obviously got a little bit of structure there, where Vishal and I will just share a little bit about some various wellbeing topics. So today we're looking at connection, and we'll be tying in a little bit around loneliness. We'll be just sort of setting the scene in terms of the background around connection. We'll be thinking about some of the outcomes of a lack of connections or feeling loneliness. And then we'll also be thinking about the behavioural science side of things, of how we can help people feel more connected. What we will encourage as well then is a really active discussion. So when we were putting this, when we were thinking this kind of series through, one of my key points was that particularly in the behavioural science community, but even broader, I feel that within COVID, we've sort of lost connection with each other. I mean, there are a lot of different podcasts, but particularly in the kind of Asia Pacific region, but more broadly, it would be great just to have something where it's not just a podcast or a series where you hear from us, but we get to hear from you as well, and we get to hear from each other to see what's actually happening versus always sort of staying on top of different readings. And so that's sort of where this came about. Is there anything that you want to add to that, Vishal?
Yes, that's well summarized, and yeah, we're hoping that this becomes an interactive conversation. And we've done some research of putting together what we some of the relevant insights, but recognizing that there's going to be rich, diverse perspectives and individual lived experiences which you might want to share or bring to the table. And there may be agreements or disagreements in perspectives, but yeah, I'm super keen and super enthusiastic for us to get that on the table so we're able to have a meaningful conversation.
Okay, fantastic. So shall we get started? So just in terms of setting the scene in thinking about social connectedness, Vishal, do you want to sort of start in terms of some of the research that you've been covering in terms of social connections and why they matter?
Yeah, and maybe firstly thinking in terms of well-being a bit broader, and some of our conversation now is going to be focused maybe on a narrow social scientist definition of well-being. And when I say narrow social scientist, it implies that not all social scientists think like this, but also recognizing that there is indigenous ways of thinking and indigenous knowledge which forms a rich body of evidence. And personally, I've been quite influenced by some of the frameworks from Maori and Pacific perspective, thinking of well-being as a system. So something to caveat is, yeah, we are going to broadly talk about well-being in a narrow social scientist context, but we'd love to extend this discussion to involve richer and more diverse ways of thinking. One of the social scientists maybe approaches of thinking about well-being is around subjective well-being. So how happy you are in your life. So that could be a combination of positive emotions you're feeling. So happiness, excitement to be at the session, enthusiasm, joy, which we get from spending time with others, and that counterbalanced with some of our negative emotions, such as loneliness, such as rejection, sadness, and that forms being happy in your life. The other perspectives which social scientists brings to the table is being happy with your life. So that's an Aristotle way of thinking about happiness and well-being. So what's my meaning? What's my purpose? What's my contribution to society? A useful way of thinking of subjective well-being is to think of it not as a destination, so not as a place which you get to and you've arrived there, but to think of it more as a leaky bucket. So over time, there are punctures which we do encounter, and a lack of social connection or loneliness is something which can puncture our well-being tire, and we might need to actively use some coping strategies to whether it's become more resilient or to come out of those situations. So that's a useful frame of thinking about happiness and well-being and the importance of social connection within this system.
One thing to add to this is that I'm very philosophical about concepts around wellbeing. I teach a MBA course around this as well, and I think sometimes a little bit critical. So I think it'll be interesting. I often in workplaces talk about what's the best person for the job, and I'm like, what does wellbeing actually mean? Recently, or there was also been times in my life where I've been really challenged and haven't been necessarily well, even though I teach some of these things, like, or felt like because of COVID well. And so this is actually why we came up with this too, just to kind of share, connect, and think more broadly. So when we go through this, I'm saying that because I think one of the biggest things that I do, particularly with my MBA students, but I think we should do, is stress test some of these ideas. Like, what are ideas that are designed by scientists that theoretically potentially work when we're looking at student populations or smaller populations, and what are strategies that actually will work when you're going through a real crisis. So to ask somebody to be really grateful after they're going through a real crisis could be useful, but could also be a little bit of a kick in the face at times of like, I'm not grateful for anything. So thinking about strategies that we can use, asking people to journal is a great option, but from a behavioural design perspective, sometimes it's really difficult to keep that momentum. So let's just start and get into this kind of human connection, because we've kind of gone on for quite a bit, but we wanted to kind of set the context and yeah, again, really open the room to stress testing these ideas, sharing sort of your openness around it, as opposed to thinking that we're all just going to be concept of well, and that the strategies that we talk about will definitely be effective. It's not always the case, and we know behaviour changes in different contexts. Okay. So let's think a little bit about, just really broadly, I think that should be quite obvious in terms of a feeling sense when you feel connected to individuals. Some of the benefits in terms of feeling connected to others has a lot of mental health benefits. It has physical benefits. So actually what you see is that if people are in a state of loneliness, they can often get into what's called like a chronic stress state, and you get really negative health outcomes. And there's been a lot of research around this where, let me know if I say this right, Vishal, but is it Vivica Murphy, right? He did some research around this. He's a medical officer in the US. And he basically found that loneliness can be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It has a huge impact on not only our mental health, but also our physical health. And it can lead to mortality. The other aspect is that it can also have a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the lonelier you feel, a sort of snowball effect, where the lonelier you feel, the more isolated you become, the more negative you become. So people can separate from, withdraw from you. But also then the benefit side of interactions and connection also is that you see in a financial well-being sense. So Natalie, I know that you're on here and had a look at this. So connections have a benefit on your mental health, your physical health, your financial health, your job performance. If you have a work best friend, you're much more likely to be productive. If you have a huge social support, you're much more likely to be productive. So in the case of connectedness, it has a pervasive effect on your life. And yet, even before the pandemic, 3 out of 4 people felt lonely in the US. In Australia, 1 out of 4 people felt lonely. During COVID in Australia, 50% of people, so 1 out of 2 people that were surveyed, but that's still half of Australians potentially felt lonely, and it's still persisting. Like, look at the Melbourne lockdown now. So it's becoming a hugely impactful part of our lives. The last really interesting piece of information I want to give here, and Vishal, I promise, then I'll pass it over, is interestingly, when people feel lonely or a lack of social connection, or when they're rejected from a social group, you actually see areas of the brain light up that's related to physical pain. So it's literally very, very painful. I mean, we may have felt this, but also you see this within the brain that I think is really interesting as well.
Awesome. That's summarizing decades of research. Thanks. Thanks, Juliette. I'd like to maybe try to change your mind on one aspect brought up in conversation, of maybe thinking of loneliness not necessarily as a negative emotion, but recognizing loneliness as a emotion. So just like think about some of our different biological drives. So if hunger is our biological drive to go out and eat food, or go out and forage for food and satisfy ourselves, I'd like to think of loneliness, and it's been described as a biological drive to go out there and seek the company of others, go out there in the world and participate in social life, recognizing that it's not always easy. Yeah, did you have any thoughts on that? Have I changed your mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a motivational drive, right? It can make sense in terms of moving forward, recognizing that emotion. Yeah, like, I think that's it's kind of quite interesting in terms of thinking of all emotions. So sorry, I'm hooked on this because I'm thinking of Glenys Doyle has just written a book about Untamed, and she talks about being happy, or being human is not being happy. Being human is feeling everything. And I love that quote, because I think that's really true. And so we assume, and that's what I mean at the beginning when I talked about it, maybe I should have started with that quote, is we often assume, and even when we work in the area, that we're all chasing this wellness and happiness, but actually being human is to feel everything. So you may be right in terms of that motivational drive as well.
Awesome. And yeah, feel free to change my mind, anyone else, when we open it up for discussion. And that's something which I'm hoping we get to through these conversations too. Thinking of strategies, so strategies to introduce social connection, some of the evidence and some of the counterintuitive strategies which have come across is seeking solitude first, which seems like the complete opposite, but really embracing solitude and connecting yourself is a prerequisite to being able to connect better with others. One of the debates going around was, is it really worth having weak connections? And it's all about growing strong ties with people, but a lot of the evidence suggests that even weak connections with people, so if you spend during your train ride or your commute, if you have exchange pleasantries with someone, and you go beyond hello and how you doing, but you have a conversation with someone about something meaningful, it leads to a boost in your happiness. And I think thinking about COVID times, that has been especially hard for us. So we don't recognize our conversations going amiss with someone who's may deliver food to your home, or someone who you might chat to in your commute.
So Jane Dutton has really great research around this. So she looks at the feeling seen, it's called. So you can make people feel socially connected or feel seen within less than a minute. So, and it can be just basically like picking up someone's pen. I mean, in a context of being online now, that's quite difficult. So feeling seen, you have to ask more complicated questions versus how are you? Feeling seen might be kind of picking up the phone more often and getting people to feel valued. But what you're talking about, these kind of in the moment, on the train sort of aspects, is actually what her research or body of research is called feeling seen.
Awesome. Thanks for building on that. And my final strategy is thinking about our connections as nutritious connections. So to seek soulful connections with people, giving people undivided time, and maybe avoiding devices when we're connecting with people, and even if it's a shorter period of time. So so Dr. Vivek Murthy talks about setting a low standard. So even 15 minutes a day with someone leads to an incredible boost, but that's 15 minutes of undivided attention with someone. Quite interestingly, the one of the blue zones in Japan, Okinawa, they have the Moai tradition, if some of you might be familiar with, where they have strong social groups which they meet on a weekly basis. So you might have 5 or 6 friends who might gather, and you bring everything to the table. Nothing is held back. So if you're having a argument with your spouse, for example, or you're going through a difficult financial situation, you're able to bring those conversations into the table, and it comes not just with sharing your own story, but spending time to listen to other people's stories. And this tradition of having it as a recurring theme really seems to contribute to putting Okinawa into the map of being as a blue zone where people have lived some of the longest and happiest lives.
Yeah.
Juliette, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, I'm curious about how this works online now, and this is something that I've been really struggling with. So I've got a heap of other strategies that we could really talk about briefly to boost connectedness. So really briefly, we can kind of go into them, but things around kindness, right? Kindness is so powerful, doing things with others, working in synchrony. So if you're working in synchrony with somebody, that can be really useful. Rituals, and whatnot. So there's quite a few things that you can kind of feel connected. So setting up rituals, even if you're away from each other, it brings a kind of social connection and makes you feel quite great. The difference between active social media engagement when you're interacting with people is really beneficial from a human connection side. I mean, not really beneficial, but more beneficial from a human connection side than passive engagement, and passive is detrimental. But the thing that I'm really curious about is, and I'm going to throw this out to the audience because I don't know the answer to this, and it's something that I've been meaning to do a little bit more research around and haven't. But I'm connecting at the moment online on Zoom all day. I mean, I'm constant back to back at times, meeting lots of interesting people. I'm still catching up with coffee for friends here or there, but I get to the end of the day and I feel so exhausted and slightly lonely. Like I do feel, even though I've connected, I've had great conversations. And so I wonder if there's different neurotransmitters that are being released, so maybe there's no oxytocin when we're online versus face-to-face. Maybe there's a difference in dopamine, and I don't know, but actually I would love if anybody has seen any research around so I know there's the Zoom fatigue research, but that's different than connectedness online. And then how do you feel more connected? Can you feel as connected online as face-to-face, or is that just completely impossible? So does anybody have any insights or research there?